So we move on to the second half of chapter 3 of the tradition of dissent of your book, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli Power, Creating a Moral Future for the Jewish People. And I have to say that this is going to be a tough second half of the chapter because we'll be talking about the Palestinian Uprising. So let's get into it. I have prepared some slides. This is to help those who are following this conversation to see the text. I think it's also important for them to see the text. Okay. Entitled our conversation, The Palestinian Uprising and the End of Jewish Innocence. And just say a recap. So we have been talking about in the tradition of dissent on Holocaust and Israel. We actually began with in chapter 2 with alternative views of the Holocaust. We look at Lopate, Margalit, Boss Evron, and of course your teacher Richard Rubenstein. And then we also look at the alternative views on Israel, and we explore the thoughts of spiritual Zionists, Asher Ginsberg, and of course Homeland Zionism, represented by Magnus, Hannah Arendt, and Martin Buber. And then last meeting, we look at non-Zionist and anti-Zionist views represented by Willem Zuckerman, Rabbi Berger, Noam Chomsky, and Jacob Neusner. And so we have been looking at this tradition, and of course there will be another level when at the start of the Palestinian Uprising. So you said, Professor Ellis, that you were writing this at the time of the Palestinian Uprising, and that the book was published in 1990, and the Palestinian Uprising began in 1987. Is that correct?
Yes, well, in late 87, but it hit its full swing in 1988.
So you were writing during the heat of the battle, so to speak.
Yeah, so I was writing this 1989 probably, because it came out in 90 and it takes a while for the book to come out. So I was writing it as the uprising was occurring and getting information, including these two quotes here, as they were being written or said. I was writing it down and narrating it.
Okay, so let's just look at this, and then we'll go back to how you were writing this at the time. So this is a quote from two leaders of the American Hebrew congregations. One is from Alexander Schindler, and both of them represent the Jewish responses to the Palestinian uprising as it was being televised on nightly, as I read it. The indiscriminate beatings of Arabs, initiated and implemented as Israel's policy to quell the riots in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, is an offense to the Jewish spirit. It violates every principle of human decency, and it betrays the Zionist dream. And then from Albert Forspan, American Jews are traumatized by events in Israel. This is the downside of the euphoric mood after the Six-Day War, when we felt 10 feet tall, now suffering under shame and stress of pictures of Israeli brutality televised nightly. We want to crawl into a hole. Let me get back to you, Professor Ellis.
Yes, this is very, very strong criticism from leaders of the Reform movement in the United States. It was part of the uprising within the Jewish community in response to the Palestinian uprising in Israel, Palestine, and the response of the Israeli government. This was the first time in Israel's history that American Jews saw what was happening in the nightly news and in newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all around the United States. I think it was the first time that the American Jewish community was confronted with what Israel had done from the beginning in different ways, but now televised. And it brought home to American Jews who believed that we were exceptional in our innocence in the Holocaust, obviously, but also in our empowerment in Israel, that something had gone terribly wrong. And what was it? We just didn't have a foundation. Although we have this tradition of dissent, it wasn't known to Jews in America, really. And so they didn't have access to the fact that there were complaints about Israeli behavior before by Jews inside and outside of Israel. So this was like a novum that was new. It was unprecedented. And American Jews who would tell their neighbors in so many ways that we were exceptional because we were good, all of a sudden everybody's seeing, not only Jews, but non-Jews are seeing this on TV too, and in the newspapers, and they're wondering, what is going on with Jews and Jewishness on all sides of it? So Schindler and Vorspan are saying that we're ashamed by this behavior. Not that we just have problems with it or there's an issue here or there that can be corrected. This is a big deal. We are now, for the first time in American history, especially since the '67 war, since we had celebrated that as a euphoric victory, not a military victory really, but a victory of right over wrong. That's how many Jews saw it. And now, all of a sudden, but very soon really, just 20 years or so afterwards, what is going on in Israel? Why are Israelis, that is Jews, acting like this? And I go back to my childhood. The idea that Jews would act like this was completely foreign to us. Not, that's too bad and that's really not proper. Completely foreign to us. And for many Jews, even at very high levels, this is Jewish establishment saying, we are ashamed. You are desecrating our legacy as Jews. We want to crawl into a hole. It's very strong language.
Yeah. You want to crawl in. It's really a sense of humiliation, and yeah, as you said, shame. And I think there is also a sense, going back to our discussion on the 1967 war, and the sense of it was a miracle, and you also have a sense of the Israeli army as a moral army, and so when they saw the Israeli army, beating Arab Palestinians, breaking their bones, I mean that idea of a moral army must have been really, crushed.
And the idea of Israel as a democracy and as a light unto the nations, and our sense of pride of being Jewish, which accelerated with the victory in 1967. Now we're being confronted by Israeli soldiers beating defenseless kids who just want to be free. And it's going to get worse. But just a cognitive dissonance over the question of what it means to be Jewish. We had been through Holocaust theology and Holocaust consciousness about our suffering, our need for power, but we were to be empowered simply to protect ourselves. What now were we doing? Now, again, when we look at the history, a lot of this had been done before, but American Jews en masse were unaware of this, and it certainly hadn't been thrown into our face, which is what Jews felt like when it was on the national news. How could Jews act like this?
Yeah.
And are you representing us, this action?
And then there also, that's not just Schindler and Forspan, but there were other Jewish personalities that have condemned it. That, for example, there was an op-ed piece at the New York Times from well-known Israeli writers like Yehuda Amichai, Amos Elon, Amos Oz, and A.B. Yeshua. And the title of that op-ed piece was "Israel Must End the Occupation." So, immediately there was already a call to end the occupation.
Well, this is within Israel now. Most American Jews aren't cognizant of what goes on in Israel. Israel is a dream for American Jews, at least at this time. But there are also Israeli Jews now who are saying this is not a war of defense. And these are also military people, because most of the Israelis serve in the military at one time or another, or even throughout their adult life. And so Israeli Jews are uprising too, because they're being called upon to mete out this punishment to Palestinians. They're being called upon to keep Palestinians down when Palestinians are struggling not to eliminate Israel, but to have their own state side by side with Israel. And so there's an uprising within the Jewish community in America, and there's an uprising within Israel. And this is also being publicized in the United States, including in Jewish journals like Tikkun, which we'll chat about in a few minutes. And it's all coming back. There's an uprising among Jews in the United States and in Israel, and there's a civil war brewing within the Jewish community worldwide. And there are sides being chosen. How can you criticize Israel? How can you not criticize Israel? We need to do this. No, we don't need to do that. And what are you saying about, this is all the question of what does it mean to be Jewish, in my view. This goes back earlier to a discussion in the New York Review of Books, very prominent intellectual journal between Elie Wiesel and others, going back and forth about, are you going to be silent about this? Because people are calling on Elie Wiesel as a Holocaust theologian who talks about the morality of Jews and how we were oppressed. What are you going to say about this? And the answer is more or less nothing. And then people were saying, you are supposedly a paragon of virtue. You are our symbolic figurehead, but you're saying nothing about what Israel is doing to these defenseless Palestinians. So, and in Israel, these soldiers are being called upon to do this, and more are refusing.
Yeah.
To refuse to serve in the Israeli army or to do what the Israeli government wants them to do is a big deal, because the defense of Israel, everything is on the line. As I said last time, or in another conversation, during these wars, whatever Israelis think, they know that if they're defeated, it's big time. So when Israeli soldiers say, we're not going to repress this uprising, don't ask us, we're not going, that's a big resistance. So there's a lot of resistance in the Jewish community, both in America and in Israel.
Yeah. And one of the Wiesel's critics is the famous scholar Hershberg. And there was a back and forth between them. And At that time, Hertzberg was a professor of religion at Dartmouth College,
Yeah.
and he was writing a series of articles for the New York Review of Books, um, beginning with the uprising and then ending with a letter to Elie Wiesel. So he was quite disappointed with Wiesel's.
Very sharp words. And Hertzberg was the editor of this huge volume titled The Zionist Idea. He's a Zionist. Wiesel's a Zionist. They're both Zionists.
Mm-hmm.
But Hertzberg is saying to Wiesel, whom we knew quite well, are you going to be silent? And the words, again, are very sharp, like with Schindler and Vorspan. This is not I'm sorry, we disagree, let's have lunch. This is about the future of what it means to be Jewish. It's all on the line.
Yeah. Okay, let's now move on to, you have already mentioned Rabbi Michael Lerner, and I'll just, let me just go back to the slide and show Rabbi Lerner's, yeah. So this is a quote from Rabbi Lerner. We did not survive the gas chambers and crematoria so that we could become the oppressors of Gaza. The Israeli politicians who have led us into this morass are desecrating the legacy of Jewish history. If Jewish tradition has stood for anything, it has stood for the principle that justice must triumph over violence. So tell us about, Rabbi Lerner's analysis of the occupations. He said something that like a logic of domination, that if it continues, it's going to be worse. It's going to be uncontrollable.
Well, Michael Lerner wasn't a rabbi when he started out. He became a rabbi, which is another story. These groups of Michael Lerner and Arthur Waskow and all were basically secular Jews who took a turn to the spiritual and ultimately, I would say, self-ordained themselves as rabbis. But Lerner started Tikkun, which is a Jewish understanding of bringing the world back together, mending the world of justice and peace. And it was quite a flashy magazine, a monthly, a lot of money, very glossy, and it also had a lot of information, a lot of writers, both Jewish writers mostly, from the United States and Israel, and it was full of dissent. And in fact, Elie Wiesel was an early board member and then resigned immediately when he found out the direction it was going to take. So they became the left wing of dissent, Jewish dissent, although I would say they became the left wing of Constantinian Judaism, which is another discussion for another time. But they were very strong, and I got a lot of important information and essays that I used in my book from Tikkun. Tikkun was very strong on the need to end the occupation. There were other parts of it when you look at it that were very paternalistic toward Palestinians, and that's again another discussion. But at this point, it became the leading Jewish leaning dissent, and carried a lot of the dissent from Israel and the United States among Jews at this time, very prominent. And Lerner became well known and almost a cult figure in a way, not in the traditional sense of cult. But the question was, for Lerner, I think, and others of that movement, would they become the next leadership of the Jewish community? Who was going to win this? The establishment Jews, although the establishment Jews in the beginning of the uprising were also uprising. So the question was, who were the Jewish leaders? And it was up for grabs. And some of the Jewish leaders were saying, hey, you know, the leadership that of Israel is taking us into a morass from which there's no way of coming out of it. And Lerner was saying the same thing. So Lerner in that quote is saying, you know, is this what we're for? Is our history of suffering leaving us here to cause suffering to another people? It can't be, he said. And if it continues, there's going to be nothing left. And in that way, he was probably right, although I don't know that he realized it later.
Yeah. I think there was so much concern about desecrating the legacy of Jewish history. I find that very fascinating. That's, basically arguing that this is not our history. Uh, and that's very, and in a way, and if I remember our discussion on theology, which is nurturing the questions that the people need to ask about the history they are creating. This is basically a theological argument.
It is, but in a very Jewish way, because it doesn't mention theology.
Yeah, and it doesn't mention God. No, it's interesting. No mention of God.
Well, Lerner will go more in that direction, but in general, Jews don't argue from the question of God, but argue within Jewish history where God can be raised at times and ignored at other times.
Very Jewish. Okay, Professor, let's move on to this group, and we're going to the that descent from the diaspora Jews, American Jews, to the Israeli Jews. And here in your book, you mentioned about this group who called itself 21st Year, and was established in Tel Aviv. And they came up with it's very interesting. You actually put the entire covenant in your book, and it's really it's a very strong condemnation about against the occupation. And they came up with a covenant for the struggle against occupation. Let me just read. These are just um, excerpts from that covenant. The occupation has become an insidious fact of our lives. Its presence has not been confined to the occupied territories. It is, alas, among and within us, and its destructive effects are in evidence in every aspect of our lives. We shall not abandon our national symbols to the distorting interpretation of the occupation. We shall not participate in any celebration, ceremony, or symbolic occasion held in the territories under occupation, or in one which lends its legitimation in any way whatsoever. And then they are very concrete, pledges, like, and this reminds me like a boycott movement. We shall not buy goods produced by Israeli settlements in the occupied territories and shall avoid any economic ties with the settlers. They also said something about uh, uh, Palestinian labor, that they will not tolerate ill treatment of Palestinians. And then this is in the army. We shall not obey any military command ordering us to take part in acts of repression or policing in the occupied territories. It's basically saying we're not going there. It's a civil disobedience.
Yeah, and it's interesting, they use the word covenant, which is a play on the Jewish covenant, but this is a covenant among, and these Israelis are two-staters. They believe that Israel has a right to exist, and they will defend the state of Israel, but they are not going to go into territories that they believe are Palestinian territories, and where a Palestinian state should be born, and use their power, military power, in their bodies to repress another people. Now, later we have this whole discussion about whether two states are just, for Palestinians even, because it's a much smaller part of what was originally Palestine. But these are Jewish Zionists, Israeli Zionists, who are saying, you know what? We will put our lives on the line to defend our homeland, our state, but we're not going to oppress another people. And we will disobey. And again, Israel's a very small state, and there's very little margin for error. So when somebody in the United States says they have a conscientious objection, they won't serve in the military, big deal. But in Israel, when you say you won't follow commands by a military commander, everything's at stake. So these are very bold statements. And it shows, again, that there was a turning point during this time, and everybody seemed to realize it. Schindler, the Reform Jews, Wurzband, and these Israeli military folks and others who are part of the covenant, they realize that everything is at stake in Jewish history right now. And they're going to take their stand. They're not going to do what the Israeli government wants them to do. And on the American side, there are Jews saying, we're not following this path. Forget it. And so again, very strong language, really unheard of, and publicized, published in the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, sometimes full-page advertisements taken out in the major newspapers in the United States. This was not kept under a bushel.
Yeah, or just written on Facebook. Or
no, this was big. And I was reading it, I was getting it, and I was copying it down at the same time. It was real time. And things were unfolding. And a lot of the things that I began to see were very surprising to me too. It wasn't like I knew everything and I knew what was happening and I had seen it before and I knew it and therefore I'll just record it. No, these were shocking statements and shocking actions to me as I was writing and to really most American Jews.
Now, going back to what you said early on about this is the last, probably the first and the last Jewish uprising. And that has something to do with, everyone is involved in the discussion, unlike now. So, so really here, everyone has to take sides.
Well, in the Israeli military, many in the military, there are stories that we'll get to later, where American military, Israeli military commanders, even as they arrested Palestinians, lauded them for their courage to resist. It's a very complicated situation. Yes, it was, I believe it was the first and last major uprising of American Jewry. And the question was, which way would it go? Could this trajectory, which many Jews were beginning to see, be changed? Could there be a turnaround? Could there be a conversion where you'd have Israel as a state secure with a Palestinian state as secure, and there would be relations between them and over time, maybe something else? Or was Israel going to be an imperial power that lorded over its power over Palestinians forever? That decision has been made now. But at that time, and maybe I'm romanticizing a bit, I lived through it and traveled through it and wrote through it. And when I say traveled through it, all over the world. There was tremendous violence and tremendous disappointment, but also a tremendous sense of hope that through this civil war among Jews in Israel and in the United States, that we might decide to change trajectory, not give up Israel as a state. That wasn't a question for most Jews, but to keep it from being an imperial power. Now, maybe Israel was already an imperial power. That's another question. But for American Jews, the sense that Israel would become an imperial power and oppress another people permanently was totally unacceptable. It was unimaginable, but it seemed to be happening. How could that be?
Okay. Okay, now we move on to the role of the Israeli historians, or the Jewish historians, in strengthening this dissent. Let me just share um, quotes from Simcha Flafon. Okay. Oh no, let's go with. Let me share about Israel Shahak, uh, actually a survivor, a Holocaust survivor, and he published this. He wrote about this article, "Atrocities as a Method," and it's and here. This is a collection of testimonies about the torture stories of torture, which I will read some later. And this is what he said: "It should be clear to everybody who reads this collection of testimonies that the systematic use of the atrocities, which in their intensity and the special intention to humiliate, are Nazi-like and should be compared to the analogous German Nazi methods, is intentional and in fact constitutes the Israeli method for ruling the Palestinians." And this is very strong criticism and condemnation, and comparing the Israeli soldiers and comparing the Israeli uh, way of treating Palestinians as comparable to the Nazis. And let me uh, refer to some of the stories of torture and humiliation. And personally, this was really, I was appalled and quite speechless when I was reading this. This is also for me very traumatic, and I can imagine you and others who was probably shocked reading all of this. So let me read some parts of this. The stories of humiliation are many and include bringing naked prisoners to open fields for death parades, tying suspects to electricity poles for hours and harassing them with guard dogs, the use of the banana method, in which a person's hands are caught from behind and tied to their feet so that a person's body is contorted into the form of a banana. And then you have the current Jesus method, where prisoners are placed in the position of a cross, their hands tied up as to be stretched out to both sides, and finally, the almost standard practice of beating fathers in the presence of their children. One soldier who testified at the hearing on the methods of containing the uprising said of a Palestinian they arrested and had beaten, "It was a beating for the hell of it. The man did not resist. We began to beat him at once. We hit his feet, his shoulders, and perhaps his head. The soldier's commanding officer then spoke. We were very nervous because of the incident. We found relief in beating him and in getting static about it. We kept beating him mindlessly."
Yeah, these stories of, well, Shahak is a fascinating figure. I met him and I spoke with him. I was traveling during this time to Israel, Palestine. I had gone there in 73, as we talked about, and then back in 84, in 86, and 87, and then was many times during the uprising. So I was there meeting with all of these people. It was and Israel Shahak. And Shahak comes from the same tradition as Noam Chomsky and Bernie Sanders in many ways, a very secular totally secular, but he loved the Hebrew. He loved living, as he said, among Hebrew speakers. But this kind of idolatry of the Jewish state, no. And this kind of torture, no. And what he pointed out, and he was with others translating stories from the Israeli press, which I started to receive monthly on mimeograph paper. And I was reading in real time stories from Israel, written by Israeli Jews, about what they were doing to Palestinians and what they refused to do. And again, this didn't get as wide a knowledge as others, but everybody was beginning to see this parts of it. And just to show you how it's very difficult for Jews in America to realize what's happening in Israel, going back to Holocaust theology, when I invited Rabbi Irving Greenberg to my Maryknoll Center, an Institute for Justice and Peace in 1988, after he talked, he wanted to take a walk with me, and we walked outside. It was nighttime. And he said to me, he said, "Mark, you say that the Jews in Israel are torturing Palestinians. Is that true?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And he was silent. He didn't tell me that I was lying or I was wrong, and he didn't know what to say. So what Shahak is saying is that this was a method. Atrocity was a method. Humiliating Palestinians was a method. Torturing Palestinians was a method to convince Palestinians that they would never be free. And the stories that come out of that were, for most Jews in America, shocking. And Israel Shahak, who was right there, was translating these stories. And of course, I was often accused of making up these stories when I was speaking on this subject in front of university audiences, and people would try to shout me down and say that I was a liar. And here it was coming from the Israeli press, but they would still say it was a lie because they didn't want to believe, and they didn't want others to believe, that Jews could torture others in the language of Hebrew.
Yeah.
It was their language.
Yeah, and that is one of the we'll talk about the use of the Hebrew language, and it's one of the shocks. Now, like for example, in this covenant for the struggle against occupation, they said something. The Hebrew language has undergone a process of contamination. It has been harnessed to the imperatives of the occupation. It has been called upon to provide a misleadingly benign vocabulary to anesthetize the repression and flagrant violation of human rights.
Yes, because language in any culture or country, or language is used indirectly when it's doing things that are obviously wrong. And when it's used indirectly, not really stating what is happening, it comes into the language and changes it, because in the end, people know what was going on. And so I used to meet during this time Palestinian kids, 13, 14, 15, 16, who had been tortured in these situations. And for the Israeli soldiers, not all of them, but some of them, it was like a sport. It was a way of teaching them a lesson. So this atrocity as a method to inform Palestinians that they would never be free and to break them, to break their spirit. Many Jews, including some Israelis, said, "We don't want to be a part of this."
But for those who were in the state of denial, how long were they in that state?
Well, many Jews have been in a state of, I would say, first of all, ignorance and denial. And the Jewish establishment has helped that ignorance and denial. And many in the Jewish establishment were ignorant and in denial. and it becomes a kind of a governing principle. And Holocaust theology was the overall theology, ideology, consciousness that enforced this ignorance and denial. And that's where the challenge was with Hershberg saying to Wiesel, don't say that Jews are innocent. This is not innocent. Don't keep doing the Holocaust as if nothing is happening now. But in the end, the Jewish establishment took on this information in its own way and really denied it again, ultimately denied that it was happening because it was too much. What to do when you have a small Jewish state after the Holocaust, which you see is not what you thought it would be? What do Israelis do? What do the Jews in America and Israel do when they realize that the dream is turning into a nightmare? Now you might say, well, turn it back into a dream, or at least get it closer to a dream by coming to grips with what really is going on. But that was a choice. This was the hope, but it wasn't taken. But at that moment, it was all up for grabs. And so everyone was quite anxious, both the establishment about the dissent, and the dissenters were anxious, because if you took it too far, why have Israel? And that's where they were much closer to the establishment than they thought. And in the end, they made a deal with the establishment that Israel as a state was more important than our behavior in that state. Even if they continued to dissent, they tried to limit dissent. And that's the situation I was in, because with these progressive Jews like Michael Lerner and Arthur Waskow and others, the Tikkun crowd, which did a tremendous service by publishing this material, but I also saw that they wouldn't go far enough, that they were trying to also rein in dissent. This I discovered in Beyond Innocence and Redemption, and then more later, when I realized that they were trying to rein me in too, so that and what Noam Chomsky talks about, the parameters of acceptable dissent. And so we had the accusation from parts of the Jewish establishment that criticizing Israel was anti-Semitic or self-hating Jewish, but then they were dissenting, some of them, but they wanted to hold that dissent in a certain way. And if you went to the left of them, you were out. So that was also part of this Jewish civil war at the time.
Okay. So let's look at some of the words of the historians at that time. You said that their work has been very crucial to this, to this brewing dissent. Okay. This is from the section on the history of oppression. The challenge of Jewish dissent during the Palestinian Uprising is to see it in historical perspective as a continuation of Palestinian suffering rather than something new and unprecedented. Thus, the Palestinian Uprising provides Jews the possibility for viewing the renewal of Jewish life in Palestine and Israel as a historical event, a century in duration, and therefore allowing fundamental judgments to be made concerning that history, judgments that can contribute to choices for the future. And you have commented a lot on the Simcha Flapan, Israeli historian, on the birth of when he wrote this book, The Birth of Israel, Myths and Realities, which was published in 1987. And but I think he died quite early. And this is this is from his book. Israel's myths are located at the core of the nation's self-perception. Even though Israel has the most sophisticated army in the region and possesses an advanced atomic capability, it continues to regard itself in terms of the Holocaust as the victim of an unconquerable, bloodthirsty enemy. Thus, whatever Israelis do, whatever means employed to guard our gains or to increase them, we justify as last ditch self defense. We can, therefore, do no wrong. Yeah, the claim on the innocence. Yet, what emerged from my reading, Flappen said, was that while it was precisely during the period between 1948 and 1952 that most of these myths gained credence, the documents at hand not only failed to substantiate them, they openly contradicted them. So, how important are these findings of Simha Klapan?
Well, very important,
Right.
because the beginning, or one of the parts of the beginning of Jewish Israeli historians saying that what Israelis think, and of course what American Jews think about the founding of Israel, and this is very absent in my Tour to Jewish Theology of Liberation.
Yeah, that's right.
Thought about it. It was through reading Flappen and others, and hearing conversations, including from Palestinians, um, that I realized, and with these new Jewish Israeli historians, very courageous, and that's going to accelerate during the uprising, but it was brewing in the 1980s, that in fact the myths we had about Israel, its founding, that everyone was against us, that we didn't do anything wrong in the founding, that Palestinians want only to destroy us, that the whole Arab, all of these myths, that Israel is a democracy, that, so that these are like in any national founding mythology, like the founding of the America, the United States, and all of that. So these historians, some of whom I've met, including Ilan Pappé, who read my Tour to Jewish Theology of Liberation and told me that it was very influential in his life as a Jew. And now, of course, he's an Israeli, but his desire to speak also as a Jew, it in a sense gave him permission. But here I was during the uprising learning about the foundation of Israel from Jewish Israeli historians, saying that what we thought wasn't exactly the case, and that Israel had conquered parts of Palestine, and they were settlers, like the covenant was accusing other Israelis in the West Bank of being settlers, but in fact, Israel is a settler country too, inside Israel. And that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had been displaced, thrown out, that there had been what was later called by Ilan Pappé an ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. This was not thought of by Jews. And then, this was the beginning of the end of the Israeli and Jewish narrative of Israel's innocence. Okay, so we have the uprising and these beatings and atrocities that are being publicized all over the world. So that's what's going on there. And then we get the Jewish Israeli historians saying, well, first of all, this isn't the first time. And a lot of the things that we believed about Israel were wrong. There's a whole history of this. So they were giving a historical foundation for a different narrative about Israel. And then Jews had to ask, if we accept this narrative, what happens to Israel? So these historians, which will go on in next chapter as well, even more in more depth, are challenging the foundations of the formation of the state. In the uprising, first we're saying, well, Jews are saying, you can't do this now. But the historians are saying, Jews have been doing this from the beginning. That's different. These Jewish Israeli historians are huge and are completely unknown by most Jews even during the uprising, but I'm discovering this myself. And parts of it are being published in Tikkun. So Jewish dissenters are now getting this information too. What to do with it? How do you narrate that as a Jew? What do you say about it once you realize that the foundations of Israel may be a democracy for Jews, but was a disaster for Palestinians from the beginning.
Yeah. So it was really a total, a cognitive dissonance because
Earthquake.
Because the myths of the foundation of Israel, and now it's called myths, but the narratives about its founding is really, it's like God. Of course, God is not was not part of the discussion. It was like it was the right thing to do. And now they're saying that it's actually immoral.
Yes, and you see the contrast, although Flappin's not talking about Holocaust theology or Holocaust consciousness, but you can see the contrast between the dominant view in America, American Jews, of Jewish suffering in the Holocaust, and therefore Jewish innocence, and Jewish innocence in the foundation of Israel. And therefore Israel is innocent, and anybody who bothers Israel is being an anti-Semite trying to destroy us like the Nazis did. And then Shahak is saying, the stuff we're doing is Nazi-like. And Jews are saying, we can't get this together in terms of Jewish identity. So the history, these historians, Flappin among them, and then more, are shaking the foundations of Jewish identity after the Holocaust. And they're going to ultimately bring down Holocaust theology, even though most Jews don't read these historians, obviously. It's going to become much more common around the world, too, not just among Jews, that Israel isn't innocent, and it hasn't been innocent from the beginning.
Okay. Let's look at other historians, and you have mentioned Pape, but there are others like you have mentioned in your book, young Israeli historians at that time, adding their voice to this challenge or to the narrative. Avi Shalim's Collusion Across the Jordan, Ilan Pape's Britain and the Arab-Israeli Conflict, 1948 to 1951, Tom Segev's 1949, The First Israelis, and Benny Morris's The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947 to 1949, which you will mention more in the next chapter. So you said that these histories are crucial to undermining Jewish naivete about the creation of the State of Israel. They also undermine the themes of innocence and redemption central to Holocaust theology, and therefore can provide a bridge of understanding between Jews and Palestinians if its reality is recognized at any deep level. Perhaps the challenge that faces Jewish dissenters today is that of achieving the depth of understanding, which will also give rise to a call for repentance. Now,
Yes.
you mentioned the call of repentance, and I can connect that with your confession. Is this where you first started thinking about that confession?
No, it's not. In 1987, when I launched my book, Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation in Jerusalem, before the uprising started, I called for two real states. I called for a confession on a part of the Jewish people to the Palestinians, and I called for reparations for the Palestinian people. I was so naive that and you had people like Michael Walzer, who was one of the respondents, really interesting, very well-known Jewish ethicist. And I was very young. And he was one of the respondents, and he was holding the galleys to the book because the book hadn't been published yet, although it was being published months before the Palestinian Uprising, so nobody knew there was going to be the uprising. But the place was, I thought, who would come and hear me? Nobody even knows who I am, but the place was packed. And Walzer, who I thought, well, that's really interesting that someone of that stature would respond to me. And when I looked over to him after I had given my talk and he was responding, he was holding the galleys and his hands were shaking. And I thought he had Parkinson's, but he was so angry that I would say what I had said. And part of it was that we owed Palestinians an apology, a confession, and reparations for what we had done and what we were doing to them. Now, when I initially broached that, I knew very little about the founding of Israel. This I was learning much more very quickly. And so there was another level in Beyond Innocence and Redemption, as you could note from the two books. They're very, very different. There's a lot more in Beyond Innocence and Redemption because I was on an occupation learning curve. I was on a repentance learning curve. I was on a Jewish identity learning curve. And so I broached that in '87, and all hell broke loose in the audience. Amazing reaction. But yes, so I had started before, but I didn't really realize the depth.
So, well,
This was,
would you continue with the Waltzers? So, what did he? So he was very angry, and what did he tell you, or what did you say?
couldn't come to grips, and he's never come to grips, and he's still honored as a Jewish ethicist. Still very much honored as a Jewish ethicist. But his view was that if I said that Palestinians were the poor in this and the oppressed, and we are, he said, as Jews, we are. You're confusing the two. So, most of these Jewish ethicists, and later we'll discuss the Liturgy of Destruction, David Roski's, they believe that Palestinians are uncivilized and do not merit our consideration. At the base, that's what I have concluded. In fact, there was quite an incident. One of the respondents in my 1987 Jerusalem talk was Shakur, Abuna Shakur, who was an Israeli citizen, but a Palestinian. And during one of the breaks, we had a number of breaks because the whole thing went on for hours. David Hartman, who was the great liberal Jewish Orthodox American Jew who lived in Israel, who the New York Times quoted all the time as a liberal Jew. I heard him, I was standing there watching all hell break loose during the break, and there was a confrontation between Hartman and Shakur. And Hartman said to Shakur, in his response to me, Shakur's response, "You have offended me," Hartman said to Shakur. And Shakur, who was always very strong but also polite, said, "I'm so sorry, how did I offend you?" And Hartman's response was, "Your presence offends me." In other words, Hartman was a racist, and Waltzer is a racist. That's what they are. They don't believe Palestinians deserve what we deserve because they're less than us. Now, they don't, Waltzer's not going to say this now, and he's not going to use this language, but my experience of Jewish progressives, and Waltzer is a progressive, and Hartman was a progressive, he's no longer alive. They're racist toward Arabs and Palestinians. And you observe it not in their public discussions so much, although you can read between the lines. And sometimes you don't have to read that far between the lines. But when you talk with them personally or hear them talk, sort of locker room talk, you see it. And even Tikkun, Michael Lerner and all, were very paternalistic toward Palestinians. And this was, they weren't really up to us. we may be doing something wrong, we may need to correct our behavior, but basically it's their fault. And why is it their fault? They can't think ethically like us, even if we're doing the unethical things to them. It's fascinating. Yeah, well, that's how it is, isn't it, with people in power? But Jews thought we were exempt from this. We could recognize it in others in the way they treated us, but we couldn't recognize it in ourselves when we were treating others when we had power. Now, the answer is not a disempowerment of Jews, in my view. That's another discussion. But to permanently oppress another people is to desecrate what it means to be Jewish. But it's also, and we had to admit it, I certainly have, it's also part of being Jewish. It's not the only part, because we are doing it as Jews. That's part of our tradition too, once we have power. And so the question becomes, again, like all the other nations, question mark. So a lot of this Jewish dissent, if you look at Lerner's language and all, was, if we keep doing this, we're going to be like them, the other nations. So we can't. But Palestinians are less than us. In their argument, you can hear it. So we need to work towards something better, but we need to be dominant because we're civilized. And we think ethically, even if we do things wrong, but they can't. Maybe they can one day, maybe with our help. This goes back to a lot of the discussion of even Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber in a way. Again, very progressive and very good, but a very European mentality over against Arabs, that we could help them become more like us, even if what we were doing was displacing them and violating their rights.
So is it about the Jewish identity or more about being, being coming from that European colonial mentality?
That's another discussion that I pick up and others have picked up, and there are different views. Again, you didn't have the travel and the Google and all of this stuff and the cultural diversity that we have today. So the meeting of Europeans and non-Europeans was much starker than it is now. My own sense is that it is partly European and partly Jewish, and that in every tradition there are elements of good and bad, and you have to struggle for the good and try to keep the good going, or at least negotiate the good and the bad. But there's no question that Israel, Jews in Europe were on the outs. That's an understatement, especially with the Nazis. But what we have done and are doing to Palestinians is wrong. And to think that they can't think ethically is racist. And Walzer and others are and Hartman was in that way racist. Now, does that mean they were bad people? No, that's not what I'm saying. But the other part of it is that Walzer and Hartman and some of these others brought Christians in the West into the Israeli drama as if we were innocent, and even when we were not completely innocent, showing them that we could be better and that Palestinians needed us. And Hartman, in the Sholom Hartman Institute, which continues now, was a conduit for a lot of the Jewish-Christian dialogue in the United States. When I was at Harvard, I noted that every year, Harvard faculty were brought over to the Sholom Hartman Institute, met with Hartman, and I think it was all financed outside of Harvard. And this was a way of really a propaganda, which a lot of the Harvard faculty, that was my experience, quite liked. And then at some point distanced themselves from, and the uprising was part of that distancing. So this is a break, not only a civil war among Jews, the uprising, it's also going to break what I call the interfaith ecumenical dialogue deal. It's another chapter, it's also the beginning of the breaking up of that deal, which also helped to empower Holocaust theology, Jews in theological education and beyond, and support by the United States for Israel. That's going to, all these things are going to be under reconstruction to some extent during the uprising.
Yes, and I think that part of the Christian renewal, that will be in part in chapter 5, which is now I'm beginning to see its role, because basically Holocaust theology was challenged strongly by Jewish dissent, but it was this somehow this Christian renewal that have enabled another Holocaust, another reading of Holocaust theology that is that justifies the occupation.
Yeah, well, we had a Christian Holocaust theology, which we'll get into, and it wasn't justifying the occupation because the occupation wasn't recognized by Christian Holocaust theology or by Jewish Holocaust theology. They didn't recognize it as an occupation. The uprising said to many Jews and others, including some Christians, there's an occupation here. Israel is not innocent. What are we going to do? As Christians have to ask, with their history of anti-Semitism, Israel became a repentance for that anti-Semitism. And Holocaust, the adoption of Holocaust theology was their repentance for the Christian anti-Semitism. And now Jews, and they romanticize Jews in Jewish history and Israel. But now, during the uprising, it doesn't look so good. And the Christians now, very good liberal Christians, forgetting about Christian Zionists, the right wing, which everyone talks about today. Israel was supported by a liberal Christian narrative of Christian repentance for the Holocaust. And the uprising begins to challenge not the need for Christian repentance for the Holocaust, but the Christian romanticization of Jews, which they needed for their own credibility.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say, that somehow that they have used Holocaust theology to renew Christianity, but also it has worked, it has functioned in another way.
And Jewish dissenters, though, were hit by these Christians, these Christian Holocaust theologians. They didn't want to hear Jews dissent because they didn't want their renewed faith to be challenged by Jews, even as they bowed before Jews like Elie Wiesel. They didn't want to see people like me.
Yeah, I know that personally. I have I have witnessed that firsthand when in your visit here,
Totally.
where I was, that was also for me a cognitive dissonance. I was thinking, what's wrong? What were you saying that would upset them? But it's true. They don't say that you were. They're not saying that that what you're doing and what you're saying is wrong, or it's a lie. They would agree to everything that you will say, except that where you want to take them.
Well, they, as Baldwin said, I'm not your Negro, and I would often say to Christians, I'm not your Jew.
Okay. So this is the last slide, Professor Ellis, and before we wrap up this section. So you ended with this thoughts about where is this tradition of dissent heading? The themes that emerge in the tradition of dissent often assume a dialectical form. Jewish renewal is haunted by the prospect of creating new victims. Jews' own history of victimization is shadowed by the present reality of power. and fear of imperiling the Jewish community is confronted with the need to question Jewish power. The larger Jewish community suppresses the direction of dissent that seeks to revitalize the Jewish witness to the world. The tradition of dissent continues even today, meaning in the 90s. Well, I'll ask you about the situation now, but can remain ineffectual. The fears expressed in reaction to dissent, often even by dissenters themselves, of recreating a climate of anti Semitism, also continues to circumscribe the ability to speak and act without equivocation. In a sense, the tradition of dissent has reached an impasse. I'm sorry, that's not an impact, but an impasse, both in numbers and in its ability to develop thought and activity without fear. Thus, the tradition can only move forward by listening and incorporating the voices and lives of those who live side by side with Jews, present enemies, Palestinians, and former enemies, Western Christians. Yes,
Yes,
Professor
I realized
Ellis, sum up.
that, yeah, sorry. I realized then, this is 1990, so 30 years ago, that the only way we, that, look, after this history, and again, when I was there in 1973 and 84, when I first met Palestinians, and even in Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, I had the question, how can I speak about this? I hadn't been taught about it, that's true. But now that I was learning about it, how could I speak about this publicly when we had suffered so much in history, when public discussion of Jews was so tainted historically and often in the present, when there was so much anti-Semitism in history, but also ambivalence toward Jews, which isn't just hatred, that was still current. How could I air this dirty laundry in public, and how could I do it responsibly? And I thought to myself, I have to speak the truth because we're now empowered. But most Jews, including progressive Jews, were afraid of that. Even when they saw something was wrong, they wanted to curb their own dissent and make sure everything stayed in a certain way, because the fear of what might happen to Jews. And it wasn't that I was unaware of this, but I simply said to myself, if we were in the Warsaw Ghetto, I couldn't air the dirty laundry of our people. But we are not. In fact, we are building ghettos for others. So I was stronger on this. And when people tried to calm me down and curb me, sometimes for my own good from their perspective, sometimes because they feared, this is Jews and Christians, sometimes because they feared of what people might hear in what I was saying. So it's not simple for Jews. You might say, well, you see something wrong, you just say it. But it's not that simple. And but we needed a breakthrough. We couldn't stay there because Israel wasn't going to stop. You think if we as Jewish dissenters could bring Israel to a stop and we could transform the situation, that would be best. But I realized even then that that wasn't going to happen. Now I know even more that it will never happen, at least in my lifetime and beyond. But we needed something more than was coming out of Holocaust theology, but also progressive Jewish dissent. And so I was already on the edge. And then some of these dissenters were trying to bring me under their tent. And so they liked me, but they thought they were afraid of me. They thought I was going to go too far. And so they courted me in some ways, but I didn't want to be disciplined. I couldn't handle that kind of discipline because I thought more needed to be said. So we had to incorporate Palestinian life, and I was the first Jewish theologian, and maybe the last, to incorporate Palestinian voices in Jewish theology. That they weren't outside, they were now inside. And we also had to deal with Christian history and its anti-Semitism forcefully, directly, just like we had to forcefully and directly confront our oppression of the Palestinian people. We had to do both. But you couldn't do one or the other.
That is a big task for Jewish dissent if it will continue.
Yeah, in public, it's big. And even today, where there's a lot more Jewish dissent and a lot more in public, you'll have Jews who shade their dissent by incorporating it into other larger issues. Yeah, I spoke directly. I didn't say I was always right or I'm not flawed. That's not my point. I spoke directly. And some speaks directly, but also I kept this history of Christian anti-Semitism that needed to be confronted. The ambivalence about Jews needs to be confronted. We can't just say, well, you know, we're all alike, and this colonialism is like other colonialisms, and it's all, you know, and you downplay your Jewishness. No, I'm very strong and increasingly strong on my Jewishness as a confrontation with where we have gone and where we are going. And so, you know, I was never, it became even lonelier in a way, because once this critique was accepted, it wasn't always spoken. And that's true today. On the other hand, there are many more Jews who are dissenting and organized in their dissent. And I've written about that as this dissent was being organized during the uprising. But this was a very special and intense time where everything was at stake. This is not like it is today in the way it's discussed. And maybe it can't be discussed that way, but the uprising and this book, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, is as it's unfolding.
To our conversation last night, and this is I think triggered by the post that I saw this morning, which is on your Facebook page while you're doing your morning walks, your daily discipline, as you would call it. And I saw a very interesting post that I think is very important in relation to what we have been discussing. So, but tell us, I think we can talk about your daily discipline and how is this part of your thinking and your exile life.
Yes, well, of course, 30 years ago, I was in the thick of things, but being in the thick of things Jewishly as a dissenter led, like for many Jews, into exile. And I wrote a book some years ago titled Practicing Exile. And as the exile deepened and became permanent, the question is, how do you keep your head above water? How do you survive? And if possible, thrive? And part of that is a daily discipline that focuses your attention and brings some focus to your mind and body. And each of us has our own discipline, really, when we think about it, whether it's getting up and having a cup of coffee or listening to music in the morning. And I take a sunrise walk on the beach where I live. It's about 3 blocks from me. And I end up in what I call the Chapel of Love, which is a structure right on the beach, a little bit away from the water, which looks like a chapel to me. And I often write there and think there, and the beauty of the sky as well. And so that's part of my daily discipline every morning. And it's about a mile away, so it's a couple of mile walk in experiencing the beauty of the world and also thinking about life. And this morning I was thinking about what our conversation last night, and I wasn't exactly clear on some aspects, and I'm still not clear, but I had further reflections and I write them down often, and that's what you saw on my post.
Okay, and let me uh, show it to you. What I have uh, taken from your post this morning. Why, if there are so many more dissenting Jews today, is the injustice effect on Jews so much less? Asked last night. My response wasn't clear. Now, thinking that the Jewish uprising which accompanied the Palestinian uprising then was about the shock of it all, at the heart of what it means to be Jewish. This was shut down in Oslo and absorbed, and over time the Jewish resistance took on the injustice, yes, as if it is one among other issues, like immigration, refugees, worldwide colonialism, and imperialism. So what is happening in Israel Palestine is no longer specifically Jewish or at the heart of what it means to be Jewish. On the one hand, a needed expansion. On the other hand, a way of reducing cognitive dissonance regarding Jewish. If everyone is involved in everything, the pressure is on all of us, not Jews in particular. In my mind, though, the easy way out, universalizing our particularity. So the Israeli occupation of Palestine becomes permanent, like other occupations, everywhere. Really? At the end of ethical Jewish history, this our Jewish response. More to think about on this is the universalization of Jewish as the white flag of surrender. So that was a very interesting post. And of course, I recalled what I've asked you last night about um, um, also my shock that this tradition of dissent is almost crushed, or it was crushed, and in a way I feel sad about it uh, because that's a very important uh, part of being Jewish. I mean, questioning the what is at stake here about Jewish history and identity. So, can you explain more about this post, Professor Ellis?
Yes, and of course, this is very controversial and tends to isolate me further, even from Jewish dissenters, and it's complicated. So I certainly don't have all the answers, but it's interesting. Jewish dissent has increased among a small minority and is extremely sophisticated. Whereas in the Palestinian uprising at the beginning, the Jewish uprising was very broad. Jews in general, not every Jew, but a large number of Jews were genuinely shocked and outraged. And again, you had the leaders of the reform movement speaking so strongly, and then very prominent Jews, Jewish rabbis and all, speaking so strongly, very Jewishly, and about Jewish history and what was at stake in Jewish history, oppressing another people. Now, we have more Jewish dissenters. It's more broadly shared at one level in an extreme small minority and much more sophisticated. But they share it in a much less particular way. It's almost as if the occupation has become normalized, not that they accept it, they're against it, but it's now in general seen as like other occupations, and all occupations should end, and that's Jewish dissenters say that, including this one. But the particularity, the outrage of Jews doing it has dissipated. And I remember during this uprising, there was a very prominent Catholic theologian, Gregory Baum, who was born and raised Jewish and converted to Catholicism, became a priest, was very important in Vatican II. And he asked me to write, or he saw something I had written. This is during the uprising, the beginning of it. He wanted to publish it in his newsletter in Canada. And when he read what I wrote, he was alarmed. And he called me on the phone. And his message was, Mark, calm down. All occupiers do what Israeli occupiers are doing. So he was being very rational about it. He wasn't wrong, but he was telling me that Jews were not the exception, which is certainly true, but that I should accept that Jews are not the exception, which I cannot accept. But Jews in general, as dissenters, have accepted that. They don't accept the occupation. They don't accept that Jews are doing it, but it's like others. So we get into the question of colonial movements, anti-colonial resistance. It's the same everywhere. But for me, I could never reconcile my Jewishness with this. Now, I'm not criticizing Jews who can, in the sense that they're not Jewish or they're not really dissenters. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I have never been able to reconcile the fact that Jews are doing this, have done it, and will do it, even though I understand that Jews are also not exceptional. Now, here's the point, too, that I raise. Jews may not be exceptional at all, but Jews have always thought we are. There's no way of being Jewish unless you believe at some point that Jews are exceptional. And it's proven by those Jews who say we are not so emphatically. There has never been a Jewishness that doesn't believe that at some point we have been singled out by God, by history, by fate. And Holocaust theology, really at its base, is saying that we are exceptional in our suffering, but that's part of our exceptionality. In other words, when Holocaust theology began, there was this universalization of Jewishness among Jews too. And the particularity of Jewishness was emphasized in our Holocaust suffering. Now, people can complain about that, but in a sense, Holocaust theology was reasserting Jewish particularity. Then there was a dissent within the Jewish community about how that particularity was being exercised over against the Palestinian people. And that was my rage. I couldn't accept it. Gregory Baum, in a very fraternal way, was saying, Mark, look, I understand what you're saying. Please calm down. All occupiers do this. He was right. I didn't accept it. And in fact, when I wrote after Auschwitz, I didn't write after Auschwitz. That was Rubinstein's teacher.
And
I wrote,
yeah.
I wrote the book Ending Auschwitz, which is the next book after Beyond Innocence and Redemption, part of a trilogy toward a Jewish theology of liberation, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Ending Auschwitz. I dedicated it to Rubinstein, and Rubinstein was as happy as a little boy. He was going around telling everybody how happy he was. And he said to me, Mark, that's it now. You have written these books. Stop writing it. The Jewish establishment will get you. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop and say, well, I've said what I have to say. Now I accept what's going on, even if I resist it, but I'm not going to shout it out loud. I'm not going to go around the world. I just couldn't do it. So in a sense,
But in a way, he was correct. Dr. Rubinstein was right.
Yes, he was right. They did get me, but they didn't shut me up. And this morning, after our discussion last night, where we discussed this to some extent.
And I think I remember telling you that, you know, in a way I was saying, okay, so it was over by 1993. You know that the occupation is permanent after 1993. But why? What kept you going? You know, it's not going anywhere. So you could have stopped there, and
Yes,
then and maybe it would have been good for your health,
my mental, my psychological health, and my
psychological health.
income too would have
Yeah,
been
your
fantastic.
economic health. Yeah.
Well, here's the deal, Professor Coy. I do not accept that Jews are going to be like the other nations. That's it. I understand people who say we are and all of that. I can also think I am not going to accept it. And Jews shouldn't accept it. And Jews that accept it may be accepting it or may be deflecting their own mourning over the fact that we have become like others. Now, were we completely different than others? No, I'm not making that argument. But you cannot sustain Jewishness without the sense that in some ways, some significant ways, Jews are different. And I just couldn't reconcile myself with the fact, maybe, that we're not. So there's all sorts of deflections. So it's about colonial movements. And, you know, when you take out the particularity, though, I think back to James Cone. There was an article I saw on Facebook that was republished from 2018 when he died. I knew Cone. And it says he was the greatest theologian of his generation. Well, that's an interesting comment, and the article is interesting in that way. But if you noticed about Cone, his initiative and his real contribution ended in 1975. He died in 2018. And it ended when he gave up on Black particularity. In a sense, he was forced to. Women said he was too patriarchal. Movements around the world said there aren't, you know, Blacks aren't the only people in the world. Come on, get with it. And Cone expanded. And in my view, he lost his voice. Now, was Cone right? Now, I'm not saying he was completely right, but if you notice in theology today, you have Black, but you have brown, you have all sorts of folks, and everybody's together struggling for justice. And who's left behind? Blacks, in my view. When his particularity was no longer possible, his voice became stilled, in my perspective. I am not going to let that happen in my voice about Jews. I certainly understand the critique of Cone's patriarchal and Black mostly and the exceptionality of Black history. I understand it. I'm with the early Cone. Because in the end, certain peoples are left behind. And the ones left behind, even though we have Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, they have been left behind theologically and historically. Jews, and there are all sorts of particularities, not just Jewish. So everyone can argue their particularity and how we come together. So there can be a universality, but the idea there's one place in the world that Jews are responsible for, even though there's American power, there's Russian, there's Christian, all of this other stuff, the one place that we could say, you know what, we're responsible for is Israel. The army is filled with Jews. The government is filled with Jews. We in America have supported Israel as Jews. That's our responsibility. It isn't like other places only. When you give up Jewish particularity, you can't give it up because ultimately there's no Jewish. And even the people who give it up, because who wants to hear from Jews that Jews are exceptional? Nobody. So to be in these movements, you have to downplay your Jewishness, not your Blackness, not your Latino-ness now, but your Jewishness. And I understand the white privilege and all of this stuff, but I couldn't I couldn't reconcile being Jewish with this behavior, and I will never accept it. Now, does that matter historically? I mean, obviously, I'm a loser in this completely, and the others will lose too. Because if Palestinians wait for a world revolution where there's no more colonialism, they're finished. It's
But
not important. Now, again, I'm arguing from Jewish particularity. The root of the global prophetic is Jewish. What do you do if the root no longer exists? There's of course, the prophetic around the world, the global prophetic, have shared values and shared histories in some ways, so that is true. But what about the root? There's a particularity of in India, the way Indians are, and Hinduism and Islam, there are all sorts of particularities. But one of them, and a very important one, although a very tiny population in terms of the world, is Jewish. So if you abandon Jewishness, it'll be carried by others, especially Christianity and Islam, in their definition of it, some of it quite beautiful and some of it deeply ambivalent and sometimes very negative. But the carriers of the Jewish prophetic, our indigenous, is Jewish history. And in a sense, what we're doing, what is happening in Palestine is also a fight for Jewish history. I can't give it up. I will not win it. I've lost it. That's true. But as long as I'm alive, I can't give it up. Now, others want me to give it up for my psychological health, for my career, or whatever that is, because they don't want to hear about Jewish exceptionality because they're ambivalent about that. So there are all sorts of good people who want, and then, so now we blame Christian Zionisms for Israel. And these are good Christians, many of them who are critiquing Christian Zionism. They want to take it off of our shoulders, our Jewish shoulders. So they say Israelis, not Jews. They say American foreign policy and Christian Zionism. They're trying to lift it off our shoulders. Don't do that. Don't take it off our shoulders. And then there are Jews who want to say, yes, I know, and in Brazil, there are problems, and there are problems in Venezuela, and there are problems in the Sudan, and there are. Don't do that. This is what's at stake is Jewish history. That history, like other histories, the Black history that Cohn represented, that's important. Much more important than him reaching out to others, in my view. He can do that too. But Jewish history, Black history, other histories are important in their particularity because that's where the universal can be deep and abiding. When we just say, oh, brother,
you sound like Magnus.
well,
you sound like you remind me of Rabbi Judah Magnus.
That's fine. I'm not a Reformed Jew, but that would be fine. I'm from the conservative tradition. So this is outrageous what I'm saying. Nobody accepts this, and I understand that. All I'm saying is, as long as I'm alive, and if my memory lives beyond me, I will never reconcile myself to what Israel has done and is doing to the Palestinian people, torturing Palestinians in the language of Hebrew, ethnic cleansing Palestine. This is not like the others, but I understand how they would say it's like the others. I'm not going there, even though I.
Do you think the others just want to get that burden off their shoulders? Other Jews who want to get rid of this Jewish exceptionality?
Yes. What Cohn realized was at some point, he couldn't continue to articulate Black particularity in the way he was. Now, it may have been a consciousness that he said, you know what, I've got to expand, but he was also forced to expand. Now, sometimes when we're forced to expand, that's good. Sometimes when we say, hey, Mark, you can't see it just like that. You have to include this, don't you think? And so that can be good. But the force of his argument ended. And were blacks liberated in these movements? No. So there are Jews who actually, yeah, they do believe that what's happening in Brazil or Venezuela or the Sudan or the Philippines is as important as what's happening in Israel and Palestine. It is for the people it's happening to. It is not for Jews. Jews have a particular history with all sorts of strands, I understand. And Israel is a Jewish enterprise with all the support that we've gotten from different entities and all. It's still the one part of the world that is Jewish. You know, we have all these conspiracy theories about Jews. Jews control the world, Jews control the economy, Jews control the media, all that. None of that's true. But Jews control Israel? Yeah, that's true. So it's our responsibility. Now, does that mean we can solve it? No, not American Jews, because Israel is also independent of American Jews. That's a whole nother argument. So even if all Jews or many Jews took my position, Israel would not be stopped. I understand that. What's at stake is our witness in Jewish history. And I don't want to be remembered, if I am remembered, as somebody who simply said, we're like everyone else.
Yeah, but isn't this is what yeah, I'll take the positions of at least what I thought are the positions of others, especially with my conversation with my former student who's in McGill, and he's doing his doctoral dissertation on Ashkenaz Jews, and so he said that most of what we know are about Jews from Europe that went to America and then went to Israel. But what about Jews that and most of them are uh, Jews that came from the colonized nations, so like Algeria, Morocco. So these are Jews with the different history.
Yeah, but
Aren't their history important too for Jewish history?
guess where they are? Most of them are in Israel or outside of where they were from. Now, I understand. I argue about European Jewish history. And by the way, European Jewish history is not white. Not white in the way we describe it. And it's very important. Other parts of Jewish history should be articulated as important too. But the diaspora has shrunk from the Holocaust and then from the creation of Israel. The great, great majority of these Jews who came from other places, not America, and are elsewhere, mostly in Israel and the United States. And there are small Jewish communities, some a little bit larger than others in different parts of the world, that have their own history and should articulate it, although they often gravitate toward Israel and America. So it's all that's complicated, and I'm just giving you my argument. When Gregory Baum said to calm down, I didn't. I didn't. Does that mean does that mean he was completely wrong? No. But the occupation now is permanent. This is 30 years later. There's no question that it's permanent. And to see it as one issue among others, my view is that in the United States, Jews should act with other American citizens on issues that are in America, no question. Refugees, immigration, social justice, freedom for blacks, that's true. And, we do that as Jews as well, but basically as citizens. But the stakes of Jewish history and what Israel is doing, Jews in Israel are doing to Palestinians, is particular to us. That's front and center. That's central. And my view is that's the key to other issues where we can authentically say to blacks, we're with you. But if we're with blacks, as many rabbis are, and they speak about it, but not about Israel, what does that mean? this progressive in all things except Israel. But if you're with everybody else and Israel is like anything else, what is that? So I'm arguing, again, against the grain, and I know there are a lot of criticisms, which most of them I know, and some I will listen to again. But the rage about the occupation among Jews is over, even among those who are much more sophisticated than during the Palestinian and Jewish uprising. That's over. It's been accepted. In my view, it's a surrender. Now, why not surrender? Because the occupation is permanent. It's over. I understand that. So even in the surrender, that is the understanding that it's over, I'm still not accepting it.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your afterthoughts, Professor Ellis. I really appreciate that. You're sharing this. Controversial thoughts, and yes, but again, history is open, and we will see what will happen.
Well, thank you, Professor Coy, for pushing me back into my rage and letting me express it with the understanding that I know there are other views and that I'm way too strong, and I will remain way too strong until the end. So thank you.